Thank you, dear colleagues and distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues and dear friends. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you to the official launch of the book, Family and Intergenerational Literacy and Learning, International Perspectives. The book really represents a significant contribution to the collective understanding of the role that family and intergenerational literacy and learning plays in fostering education, equity, and social cohesion worldwide. As we reflect on the complex educational challenges of our time, we recognize that they require thoughtful, cohesive, and also inclusive responses. Learning does not occur in isolation. It spans over generations, contexts, and different communities. Family and intergenerational literacy and learning is a powerful, yet often underappreciated approach that strengthens both the individuals and communities. It enables children to succeed in their education while supporting parents and caregivers in developing their own literacy and numeracy skills, empowering them with self-confidence, agency, and social engagement. It is a practice that not only enhances educational outcomes, but also fosters social networks, civic participation, and the transmission of cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. The inspiration behind this book is the recognition that while much of the existing research on FILL has been shaped by Western perspectives, there are rich and diverse models from around the world, particularly the Global South, that deserve greater attention. This book amplifies those voices, offering insights into the various ways in which family literacy and learning is conceptualized and practiced across linguistic, cultural, and also national borders. With contributions from scholars representing low and middle income and non-Anglophone nations, it challenges conventional narratives and highlights innovative and context-specific approaches that have long been part of intergenerational knowledge systems. UIL, in collaboration with the Goodling Institute for Research in Family Literacy at Pennsylvania State University, has worked to bring together those perspectives. The result is a volume that provides a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of FILL as a dynamic and essential component of lifelong learning. Importantly, this book also sheds light on the historical and socio-cultural dimensions of intergenerational learning, recognizing that many of the countries featured were once colonized. Rediscovering and revitalizing traditional knowledge systems and indigenous languages is not only an act of cultural preservation, but also a means of fostering resilience, community prosperity, and sustainable development. I would also say of human rights. As we launch this book today, we celebrate not just the scholarship it represents, but the real-world impact of FILL in shaping more inclusive, equitable, and empowered societies. We hope really that this book will serve as a catalyst for further discussion, collaboration, and also policy development in the field of family literacy and learning. I would really like to thank the editors, Dr. Esther Prins and Dr. Rakhat, Zholdoshalieva, as well as the many contributors who have made this volume possible. The dedication to advancing this crucial area of education is really very much appreciated. We invite all of you to engage with the ideas presented in this book, to share your reflections, and to consider how we can collectively ensure that family and intergenerational literacy and learning remain at the forefront of lifelong learning initiatives. Let this be a step towards a future where no learner is really left behind, regardless of their circumstances, culture, or geography. So before, now I invite Mrs. Lee Hollis from the College of Education of the Pennsylvania State University to take the floor. We would like to share with all of you a short video before starting this webinar. Katja, please.
Family and intergenerational literacy and learning programs benefit both children and adults. They boost literacy, numeracy, self-esteem, social connections, and lifelong learning opportunities. Intergenerational learning has thrived for millennia, but remains underdocumented in many regions. Family literacy and learning programs exist worldwide, yet research often overlooks non-Anglophone, low, and middle-income nations. The literature lacks a nuanced view of informal family and intergenerational learning across print, oral, and digital literacies. Our new book, Family and Intergenerational Literacy and Learning, International Perspectives, fills this gap. Proud to launch this work today. Thank you to all our contributing authors.
Over to me now? Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Dr. Leah P. Hollis. I'm the Associate Dean of Access, Equity, and Inclusion, College of Education, Pennsylvania State University. First, let me kick off with a hearty congratulations to the authors and the editors for this phenomenal contribution to literacy. I'm delighted to kick off this book launch regarding family, intergenerational literacy and learning, and international perspective. And certainly a hearty welcome to the over 150 participants who have joined in to listen to, oh, I'm sorry, 162. Great. So thank you so much for joining us. So I'll start off with this book addresses a vital yet underappreciated component of lifelong learning. Phil is how I'll refer to the book, FILL, benefits not only children and adults who participate, but also their broader communities by fostering resilience, adaptability, self esteem, agency, and civic participation. It supports both children's education and parents' literacy and numeracy development while creating social networks for ongoing learning. The book discussed in the text focuses on global perspectives of Phil, particularly in low and middle income countries across the globe where research on family learning is limited compared to other global communities. The book features contributions from diverse regions, highlighting the importance of integrating local traditions, languages, and intergenerational knowledge systems into family learning practices. The book challenges Western dominated perspectives and underscores the need to avoid marginalizing other cultures and literacy practices, which can lead to an systemic injustice. By presenting 20 chapters with varied approaches to fill worldwide, the book illustrates the sustainable family learning grows best when aligned with local history, culture, and traditions. It aims to inspire policymakers, educators, and scholars to recognize Phil's role in promoting inclusion, equity, and peace in education globally. This book is very important because it broadens our understanding of literacy by highlighting diverse culturally grounded practices from across the globe. The text provides an alternative to Western centric models and emphasizes the value of oral traditions, community based knowledge, multilingualism in family learning. By centering perspectives from global South and Indigenous communities, the book pushes for more equitable, inclusive, and decolonized approaches to lifelong learning. Ultimately, it redefines literacy as a relational, intergenerational process that empowers families and strengthens communities. The book also shows how literacy programs can promote social justice when they are rooted in local context and designed with community participation. It presents case studies that blend formal and informal learning, illustrating how families adapt to shifting political, economic, and technical realities. The contributors advocate for expanding the definition of literacy beyond reading and writing to include digital skills, cultural knowledge, and everyday practices. Taken together, these chapters offer a powerful argument for reimagining literacy as dynamic, embodied, and essential to collective well being. So, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to outline just a few points that we could focus on when we consider this phenomenal work. The book underscores that family and intergenerational literacy is vital yet underappreciated aspect of lifelong learning. It provides benefits that extend beyond academic outcomes, including greater self-esteem, stronger social networks, and civic engagement. While intergenerational learning has always existed informally, structured field programs emerged in the United States in the 1980s and have spread globally. The term "Phil" is used in this book as an inclusive umbrella that encompasses diverse global terminology and approaches. The key problem the book addresses is the overrepresentation of perspectives from high income Anglophone countries in the existing Phil literature. The editors aim to spotlight Phil models from low and middle income countries and non-Anglophone countries, especially the global South. The book critiques a colonial perspective embedded in some international Phil models, especially when Western programs are uncritically transplanted into non-Western contexts. The authors in this volume explore Phil as shaped by culture, community, and local knowledge systems, not just school-based literacy. The editors call for valuing informal, place-based literacy practices that may not fit traditional academic molds but are powerful and enduring. Overall, the book is a call to rethink Phil, culturally responsive and context sensitive ways that promote inclusion, sustainability, and justice. With a host of international scholars, this brings a unique perspective to learning, which embraces how various communities use traditions steeped in community practice. The book brings a vital contribution to understanding literacy from a truly international, non Western perspective. Once again, congratulations to the authors and the editors for this publication, and I return the book launch back over to our wonderful scholars. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hollis. I think it's my turn to speak now. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Stanistreet. I'm the head of knowledge management at UIL, and I've overseen the production of this book. I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of Isabel and Professor Hollis, and to extend my congratulations to Esther and Rakhat and to all the contributing authors, as well as to the knowledge management team at UAL for bringing together this very important book. The book expands and enriches the current literature on family and intergenerational learning, and succeeds very well, I think, in capturing voices from every world region, but with a special focus on the global South. And that's a focus, I think, that makes this publication both unique and also very necessary and very timely as well. And I say timely because I think that at this moment, it's more important than ever that we promote understanding across cultures and across borders, and try to see past our own prejudices about what works and what doesn't. And this is part of UIL's mandate. And I think the great thing about this book is that it speaks directly to that mandate. So it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce and moderate this part of the webinar. We're going to hear first from the two editors, Esther and Rakhat, who've done a remarkable job in taking this project from the germ of an idea to the publication we're here to launch today. And after that, I'll give the floor to 5 of the chapter authors, and there are 20 chapters in total in this publication, and around 50 contributing authors who've all been brought together. And the 5 authors we have, they'll offer insights from their papers. We're going to hear from the following. Chris Milora, who's lecturer in education studies at Goldsmiths University of London and associate academic at the University of East Anglia UNESCO Chair in the UK. Omobola Adelore, Professor of Adult and Distance Education and Deputy Director of the Distance Learning Center at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Josephine Hamero, Assistant Professor at the Department of Family Life and Child Development in the College of Home Economics at the University of the Philippines. Charles Mifsud, Professor of Language and Literacy Education and Director of the Center for Literacy at the University of Malta. And Zoya Kincaid-Clark, who's Senior Lecturer at the Early Childhood Education School of Education at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. There is a Q&A function you'll have seen, I think, already on your screen that you can use to put questions to the editors and the authors at any point during the webinar. I'll select a few at the end, and time permitting, we can put those directly to either to the editors or to the authors. Otherwise, participants will try to answer them directly in writing during the webinar. Those responses should be visible to everybody. But let me begin by inviting the two editors, Esther Prins, Professor and Co-Director of the Goodling Institute for Research in Family Literacy at Pennsylvania State University, and Rakhat Zholdoshalieva, Team Leader, Quality Learning Ecosystems Program at UAL, to offer their perspectives on this project and this publication. I'll give the floor to Rakhat first, who'll talk a little bit about the rationale for the book before handing over to Esther, who will draw out some of the leading themes. Rakhat?
Thank you so much, Paul, and everybody for the wonderful and kind words of appreciation as well. I would like to start with saying hello to all around the world who are joining today with us and celebrate this achievement together with us, with the authors as well as editors. I would like to briefly speak about the context and work of UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning from which this book project has stemmed. I don't want to go further about defining family and intergenerational literacy and learning because previous speakers, both Dr. Kemp as well as Dr. Hollis, have highlighted. I want to state here one important issue is related to the terminologies used in the book. Researchers, practitioners, and policymakers around the world use different terms to denote programs, practices, and policies that are related to family and intergenerational literacy and learning. Such terms included family literacy, family learning, family language literacy and numeracy, family and intergenerational learning, home learning, parental education, and many others. In this book, authors use different terms depending on the topic, academic disciplines, geographic area, or the organizational definitions that they use for the programs. For instance, family literacy is a most common terminology used in the United States of America, whereas family language literacy and numeracy originates in the UK in particular. In this book, however, we follow UNESCO's definition by employing FIL as an umbrella term that encompasses the related terms that I listed above. I want to also highlight a couple of other matters. UIL has been promoting family and intergenerational literacy and learning for several decades now. And we do so by not just publishing such wonderful book collection of wonderful book chapters like today, but also providing online and offline capacity building courses for policymakers, for practitioners, program designers, but at the same time family members. And you can see on the screen a few of these examples that we have. If you're interested in collaborating with us, please contact my colleague Chung Dol-ma. She is managing the online courses for capacity development as well. We'll be happy to collaborate with you. We also have been publishing many other materials. Here I share some of them since we published, since 2015 that we published. This includes guidelines that are very comprehensive approach, step-by-step approach into developing family field programs. We have also policy brief, targeting the policymakers, but then we also have very good collection of case studies. And during COVID, we also prepared an issue note for many of the family members, but also program designers to develop field approach opportunity for learning when everybody was in the lockdown. And I would like to actually thank all of the authors taking this opportunity for their commitment, patience, for making sure that we go through this process together. But also I would like to thank my co-editor, Esther, Professor Prins, for her very disciplined, very committed work throughout this project. I think without colleagues from the knowledge management team, Paul Stanislit and our wonderful graduate assistant at the Penn State University, Goncha, and my colleague Chung Dolma, Katya Rome, and Anna Bosaglu, this project wouldn't have come to fruition as we celebrate today. And without further ado, I would like to invite Esther to give a little bit sneak peek to the themes of this book. Thank you.
Thank you. I join Rakhat and others in giving my thanks to the UIL and UNESCO teams, to all the chapter authors, to Rakhat and Goncha, our GA, who did the vast majority of the work on creating the index. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of the work that we do at the Goodling Institute, where I've served as co-director since 2005, as well as being a professor in the lifelong learning and adult education program. So the Goodling Institute provides national leadership that promotes the value of family literacy and supports program improvement through research and its application to practice and professional development. So these screenshots of publications really just give a small sampling of the publications and research that we have done, largely based on evaluation or research of existing family literacy programs. We've been particularly concerned with documenting how adults learn and benefit from family literacy program in addition to children. We provide professional development and technical assistance to programs. We publish research and policy briefs, and we try to make our findings accessible to public audiences through presentations, webinars, reports, and other means. Next slide. This slide shows some of the existing books and handbooks on family literacy and learning. A couple of these, I think, have been published since we started the book. So I co-authored the light blue book on the top row with Jackie Lynch, who's here with us today in the audience. And so very few of these books include research outside of the USA. For instance, the 2012 handbook in dark blue on the top row has chapters from Canada, England, Netherlands and Germany, New Zealand, and South Africa, and that's it. So this literature really pointed to the need for a more global perspective. Next slide. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how the book came to be. So I was coming up for a sabbatical and I approached UIL in spring of 2019 about spending my sabbatical there in 2020. And at that time, we had agreed to work on some sort of publication related to family literacy that UIL had already had in their publication plans. We know what happened in 2020, so my sabbatical was postponed to 2021. Rakhat and I discussed various ideas and settled on this idea of an edited book that would focus on Phil around the world and would be an open source publication. And that was, of course, approved by the director at the time. So the rationale for the book is spelled out here. As previous speakers have already said, the literature tends to focus on the dominant models and approaches to family literacy and learning, largely focused on programs and less so on informal language and literacy practices in families. And of course, this research largely highlights the practices and programs in English-speaking higher income countries, especially USA, Canada, and the UK, and to a lesser extent, Western Europe. So Of course, Phil programs, models, and policies outside of those regions are not well documented, with some notable exceptions. So we believe ours is the first book to focus exclusively on Phil internationally. We also thought that the literature lacked a complex understanding of informal family and intergenerational relations and learning, including literacy as practiced in various regions of the world. And Phil models and programmatic practices from North America or the UK may be less relevant, successful, or feasible in other countries for several reasons, because people have differing approaches to language and literacy learning, parent-child roles and interactions, family structures, educational systems and policies in countries and communities around the world, and of course, differing levels of material resources. So just one brief example, family literacy programs in the US, Canada, UK tend to assume a nuclear family that may not exist in places where people of different generations help raise children as a wider network. They also assume a relationship where parents and children are conversational equals. Again, that may not apply in other locales. And we also don't know as much about innovative programs that incorporate local knowledge and respond to community needs in international contexts. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Yes, so this volume offers scholarship on Phil theories, policies, research, and practice, again, in lower middle income and or non-Anglophone countries. There were two exceptions, and those are chapters focusing on immigrant or refugee minority groups in the UK. So we hope that this book will create possibilities to transfer knowledge across linguistic, cultural, and national borders, and also contribute to scholarly efforts to show how family literacy as a concept and practice is situated and informed by distinctive historical, social, cultural, and political contexts. Okay, so I'm not going to read this whole slide, and unfortunately time prevents me from being able to name each chapter author individually. But collectively, if we look across the book, the chapters focus on both rural and urban communities and on groups whose language literacy and educational practices have received little attention in the literature, whether Indian immigrants in South Africa, indigenous families in Argentina, India, Nepal, rural parents in China, and so forth. There's also a vast array of topics and scales. So we have everything from the micro scale of linguistic and literacy interactions in one family to the macro scale of Phil policy and theoretical frameworks that offer new ways of thinking about Phil. Some chapters focus on how language literacy and intergenerational learning are practiced informally, whether in families, communities, or regions as a whole, or they examine non-formal Phil programs for all the way from Argentina to the UK and other countries in between. Two chapters look at parents' perceptions of children's education in China, how they're involved in that, both in China and in Greece. And a couple of chapters discussed how Phil programming and support for families had to shift during the pandemic. Finally, chapters discuss innovative ways to teach digital literacies or to use digital platforms and technologies in regions or countries like Africa, the Caribbean, Mexico, Uganda, and Turkey. Next slide. Another strong focus was multilingualism, again, at different scales of families, communities, regions, or programs. And I've listed some examples here. And along with that, those chapters really emphasize the need for offering bilingual or multilingual programming or showing how families use multiple languages in their intergenerational learning at home, particularly when it's between children, parents, grandparents, or extended family. And these chapters really call for viewing languages as a resource for developing children's and families' literacy and learning. I'll also point out the multiplicity of Phil practices and program models. One chapter covered a very well-known model, the Hippie International model of family literacy, specifically in Liberia in this case. All the other programs that were discussed were individually designed, tailor-made. The chapters also highlight learning outside of formal institutions, the need for programming that is locally relevant and really includes families' knowledge and everyday language and literacy practices, not just school-based literacies. So the book as a whole really underscores the idea that people flourish when these programs are informed by community histories and traditions, cultural resources, and when they respond to existing and emerging needs. Next slide. So one of the cross-cutting themes is that shifting our gaze to the lower and middle income, non-Anglophone countries where most of the world lives helps correct this predominant cultural and geographic focus on the USA, Canada, and the UK. And these chapters, all but a few, focus on countries that were once colonized. And so several chapters reveal how colonization has continued to affect language literacy and intergenerational learning practices and the need to recover, legitimize, and build on these practices as we move forward. External reviewer for our book wrote that ultimately it shows the importance of understanding how family literacy can be practiced differently in different cultural contexts. And so the text does, we think, enlarge our understanding of informal family literacy practices, as well as non-formal family literacy programming across the globe with multilingual families and communities, and often in places that have limited material resources. These material limitations call for creative, inexpensive, locally relevant teaching materials, whether it's computer keyboards made of clay to practice how a keyboard works, to beeswax modeling clay that one of our chapter authors will discuss in a few minutes. So I want to close by noting that Phil programs often help parents learn about school systems and how to support their children's education. So exposure to Western style education and practices may make families more school-like, but also, on the other hand, provides them with access to dominant institutions, languages, and resources. As formal education expands globally, parents, and it's often mothers, are expected to stimulate children's cognitive development outside of school. And so our book offers insights and questions about the benefits and consequences of the expansion of Western schooling. So a central question is how Phil programs can both help caregivers understand the school system and enrich children's learning at home, without also displacing the informal, culturally based knowledge and practices, or without converting home into just an extension of formal schooling. And the book ends with Hilary Jenks's interdependence model of critical literacy, which incorporates 4 dimensions: power, access, diversity, and design. And in this book, she addresses the access paradox, which is basically what I've highlighted above, that people do need access to the discourses, languages, literacy practices of people in power, but there's also a need to affirm and validate the non-formal, diverse ways that people use language and literacy in their everyday lives outside of formal settings. So we think that this model can help educators decide how to incorporate diverse literacies, knowledge, and practices into programming, and also help researchers and policymakers understand both the school-based and out-of-school literacies in educational sites, communities, and families. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rakhat and Esther. I think that gives us a very good platform from which to dive immediately into the individual contributions from the book in a bit more depth. I'd ask the contributors to limit their remarks to 7 minutes, which should hopefully give us a bit of time for questions and answers at the end. And again, please post these using the Q&A function. So our first contributor is Chris Milora, again, lecturer in education studies at Goldsmiths University of London, an associate academic at the University of East Anglia, UNESCO chair. In the UK. Dr. Milora, perhaps you can tell us a little about your chapter.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. I hope you can see my screen, everybody. See my screen?
Yes.
Perfect, great. So again, thank you to our colleagues at the UNESCO, at the UIL, and the Goodling Institute for Research in Family Literacy for this invitation, and of course to contribute to the book. I'm pleased to share with you our chapter, which has been co-authored by Dr. Helen Bines, Dr. Sheila Aikman, and Professor Anna Robinson-Pant. We are part of the UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation, which is based at the University of East Anglia. And the aim of the chair is to deepen our understanding of how adult learning can address inequalities in some of the poorest communities in the world. Our work has been conducted in partnerships with Bahir Dar University in Ethiopia, the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines, Jibovan University Center for Education, Innovation, and Development in Nepal, and the University of Malawi. In fact, some of our colleagues, Anuprita Shukla, Kamal Raj Devkota, and Sushan Acharya have also authored a chapter in this book on decolonizing literacy in India and Nepal. So go check that out as well. In this chapter, we propose a reimagining of family literacy, and we do that by drawing on in-depth ethnographic research into how families learn in indigenous and local communities in global South contexts. And I think some of the debates we're engaging in our chapter have already been covered by Esther and some of our colleagues earlier. And really, this is that a lot of the existing literature and practices on family literacy have been shaped by global experiences from the global north in countries like the US or regions like Europe and Canada. We see that these perspectives often frame family literacy as a means of fixing disadvantaged families based on the assumption that, number one, parents are the main caregivers, the nuclear family is the norm, and that schools are the primary sites of literacy interaction. Now, we see that embedded in these assumptions is a deficit discourse, one that portrays vulnerable families as lacking resources, skills, or time to support their children. And in this view, the problem is seen as being within families themselves, rather than wider systemic and contextual factors affecting a literacy experience. So, and we found, as some of our colleagues have identified already, that some of these assumptions are then being transplanted uncritically into global South contexts, where there's significant contextual differences, of course. So our approach that we're proposing in this chapter is really to make visible pre-existing family, intergenerational, and indigenous literacy and learning practices in these communities. Now, the challenge to this deficit thinking have already existed since the late 1980s. But we have had recent collaborative studies with colleagues in Nepal, Malawi, the Philippines, and Ethiopia that sort of offer fresh insights. And I would like to share 3 key findings from our research with you this afternoon. First, we found that even in highly resource-constrained environments, we found that there's a wealth of literacy practices that support learning for both children and adults. In Nepal, for example, religious literacies played a very important role in intergenerational learning. In a Gurung Buddhist community, young boys learned to read Tibetan bond scriptures with priests and later helped digitize these texts to make them more widely accessible. Our colleagues in Ethiopia found that Orthodox Church traditional schools would provide structured, but also non-formal, informal literacy learning for young boys. Now, these types of examples challenge the narrow definitions of what counts as a literate environment that prioritizes formal institutions like libraries or printed media, while overlooking valued community-based literacy practices such as those that I've shared with you just now. The second finding is that literacy is often equated solely with reading and writing, but our research reveals a broader understanding. In Malawi, for instance, our colleagues there have documented how young people and elders would co-construct knowledge related to livelihoods. So for instance, you see here a young boy and her mother or aunt, I think, who they're collecting mushrooms together. Elders would teach children how to distinguish between edible mushrooms and poisonous varieties, and how to properly harvest and store them for sale. Now, these types of knowledge transfer, which relied on sensory and experiential learning rather than print literacy, highlights the importance of recognizing the diverse forms of literacy beyond text-based skills. The third finding, there is an expectation that parents are children's first teachers, which underpins many of family literacy programs, but this is not universally applicable. In the Philippines, for example, migration patterns have reshaped caregiving roles. In one of a rural community that our colleagues there worked with, it was affected by female migration, where grandparents and extended family members increasingly took on the role of supporting children's literacy and learning. Meanwhile, as you can see in the picture, elders would also learn from their grandchildren, particularly using mobile phones and digital technologies to stay connected with family members abroad, which underscores the importance of two-way intergenerational learning and challenges that one-directional view of knowledge transmission from adults to children. So, what then does this research tell us about how we might think differently about family literacy theoretically? In our book, we look to the concept of life ways, this indigenous concept. Life ways refer to the shared ways of life, values, and social interactions of a community, including relationships both with human and non-human entities. In indigenous context, life ways are dynamic and deeply connected to language, identity, and knowledge passed across generations. Now, education and learning systems play a crucial role in sustaining these traditions, often differing from those shaped by states and markets. Building on this, we propose an approach that, one, values place-based knowledge and self-identification. Two, recognizes learning spaces and practices beyond formal institutions. And third, engages with communities on their own terms rather than imposing external literacy frameworks. Ethnographic style research, such as those that I've explained here and our colleagues in other chapters have also implemented, is useful because the starting question is what literacy practices and learning cultures already exist in these communities. Now, we conclude in our chapter, and I'll conclude here now, that we are not advocating for a universal model. Rather, what we want to highlight is the need for methodological and theoretical approaches that begin from a resource-based perspective rather than a deficit-based one. You adapt this perspective, family literacy programs can shift from identifying what families lack to building on what they already have and value, and therefore targeting whole communities rather than isolated families. Ultimately, that this approach, we believe, can help not only the global north context, global south context, but also in the global north. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Dr. Milura. I'm going to move straight to our next speaker, Omobola Adelore, who is Professor of Adult and Distance Education and Deputy Director of the Distance Learning Centre at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Professor Adelore, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd like to thank Esther and Rakhat for doing a good job on the material, and it gladdens our heart that is Dr. Solomon Oluseun Ojedeji, who is also a co-author with me on the work. Well, I'd like to briefly go into just an overview of what our chapter is about. Is in chapter 3, and the title is Indigenous African Intergenerational Learning Practices and the Role of Technologies. Well, by way of introduction, Indigenous African intergenerational learning practices are deeply rooted in Africa's rich cultural and traditional heritages. And many African communities rely on oral tradition to transfer knowledge, history, and cultural values from one generation to the next. Now we have discussed in the text 3 indigenous intergenerational learning systems or practices. These are 1, Tales by Moonlight, 2, initiation ceremonies, 3, traditional apprenticeship systems. I think I'd like to first of all discuss the Tales by Moonlight. Tales by Moonlight actually often happen in African family systems where, you know, Africans live in a communal life. Generations live together. You have great-grandfather with grandfather, father, mother, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all live together in a compound. And they are all responsible for one another's care. Now, tales by moonlight often occur in the nights after the day's work. An elder or a skilled storyteller within the community sits with children, women, boys, girls together, where they share folk tales, myths, legends, histories, proverbs, sayings, and moral stories with the younger members of the community. And it's for entertainment, but more importantly, these stories actually convey valuable life lessons and cultural norms and ethical principles. These Tales by Moonlight often provide a platform for exposure to indigenous knowledge and moral lessons. That is, children are exposed to understand the consequences, that is, consequences of greed, arrogance, bad behavior, and benefits of good behavior. Also, it also guides children in understanding social contract. What are acceptable behaviors, values, and traditions within the society? Also, it provides a platform for children to learn songs, histories, proverbs, sayings. It also highlights the importance of learning and critical thinking. Interaction with the elderly can actually provide opportunity for the children to learn a deeper knowledge of about the indigenous language. The second one is traditional apprenticeship practices. In Africa, forms of traditional informal methods of vocational training. It is informal method of vocational training where young ones are exposed to learn trades and crafts through hands-on experiences under the guidance of a skilled master craftsman. Skilled craftsman, that might be a man or a woman. It can happen in any either between the man, it can be a man, a craftsman, or a craftswoman. It had certain features and scope. 1, it is conducted in the local languages. 2, it's also rooted in the local culture. It is completely out of formal education and training structure. 3, it also exposes the learners to embedded literacy practices, such as numeracy. How do you count? How do you document? Which usually happens by symbolisms. Also, it's also via hands-on, and it focuses on trades and crafts. Usually, the trainees are sent to members or known persons to the family. The father may be a friend to the trainer, to the master craftsman, or a neighbor, or even a family member. but it actually engenders entrepreneurship and skills, valuable skills acquisition by the trainee. Also, we have what we call the initiation ceremonies. These are important rites of passage that mark transition from childhood to adulthood, or it signifies entry into specific societal role. It entails going through a fundamental set of rites to begin a new phase of life, signaling progression to a more mature phase. We have different kinds of rites of passage. You can have childbirth rites. Africans actually believe that a child's future is spiritual. So during naming ceremonies or before, spiritual help is sought to know the destiny of a child. And this is to align a child's purpose and training towards the future that is already identified spiritually. Also, initiation rites may happen into groups and fraternities. This is usually an esoteric practice. Then we also have death rites, particularly amongst the nobles, the kings. When they die, a king is buried with live or living slaves, living wives, gold, tools, and food, believing that in the afterlife that he's going into, he will learn the culture there, but he also needs help from where he is coming from. Now, this initiation ceremonies introduces the initiates to communal living. That is, you conscientize the new initiate to his responsibility in the community. They are introduced to adulthood and its privileges, its responsibilities and challenges. Also, it exposes them to information on family life, procreation, sex, and family responsibility. That is the third one. Now, as of today, our policies do not reflect these practices. If we consider our policy, if you look at the language in education policy, as a matter of fact, indigenous languages are used only at the lower level of the primary school. That is in the public schools. In private schools, local languages are not even used at all because parents frown at it. There's a gross misconception about local languages. And also, what has impacted some of these practices is modern schooling and urban development on indigenous learning practices. Indigenous knowledge and skills, once shared informally via oral traditions and apprenticeship and communal activities, have been devalued or replaced by Western style formal education. In addition to colonial education, urban development and urbanization have shaped indigenous intergenerational learning practices. For example, in Africa today, our family arrangement is mainly nuclear, whereas it was not so. We had the extended families living together so that the older generation would teach the younger generation a lot of things about life. Now, we are suggesting that using technologies can help to strengthen, expand, and reach indigenous intergenerational learning. For example, mobile phones have great educational potential in Africa because one, they have higher rates of penetration. Many people use them. Even market women. It's ubiquitous and it's less expensive. So it is easier to promote indigenous intergenerational learning through the creative use of technologies by curating educational content on mobile phones. It could be a powerful way to preserve cultural wisdom and oral tradition. Also, we suggest that such, for example, our folk tales, which were mainly oral, can be also curated or even made into ebooks and animations. This is to stimulate the interest of children or school-age children for culture and language learning. And also, among generations, understanding that we have the older ones who are digital immigrants and we have digital natives, there are things they can learn across the culture, across generations. So we're suggesting the use of technologies for these things. For example, also the use of YouTube to teach trades, crafts in classrooms, just not what happens in the four walls of the classroom, but addition using YouTube and other technologies available to transfer the knowledge that is available to us. So thank you for that. Mainly that is what we shared in the book. And I hand it over back to Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was fascinating to hear about the creative use of technology in cultural transmission, which well, I hadn't thought about before. So thank you very much for that. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Josephine Hamero, Assistant Professor at the Department of Family Life, Child Development in the College of Home Economics in the University of the Philippines. And I hope you'll tell us something about the key arguments from your paper.
Good evening. Let me share my screen. Okay. Good afternoon. I am Josephine Hamero, and together with my colleague, Ms. Teresa Hamora, we will show you how we used open-ended play materials to help families with infants build literacy routines during the pandemic. The Philippines was in lockdown for 20 months. Within this time, our laboratory preschool adapted our services to continue reaching families within the quarantine. Our indigenous culture of using orality to educate children has been missing in early years literacy programs. Existing programs still rely on print materials as resources. Early in the program, feedback from families indicated that reading books to infants was challenging and discouraging. Strict quarantines also made procuring materials difficult. Parents wanted a more interactive approach to literacy. They said it would also be easier for them to participate in our sessions if materials can be sent to their homes. This was how the never ending storytelling kit was formed, and it was certainly a boost of morale for our families to receive resources while they were required to remain in quarantine. The never-ending storytelling kit was curated using open-ended materials like clay cloths, beeswax clay, beanbag dolls, pigments, beeswax crayons, and wooden blocks. Every session, we coached parents how to use open-ended materials as the foundation for combining our oral tradition and print materials for their immersion literacy routines. This is an example of a play invitation that came with a kit. We provided both digital and printed copies of these play invitations. Simple procedures provide suggested uses for the kit beyond our weekly session. Guides for conversations and links to more resources were also included to enrich the use of open-ended materials for literacy routines. While the play invitations gave ideas on how to use the kit, we wanted to extend the use of open-ended materials to support development. We wanted to demonstrate that by being more intentional, we can make literacy routines more enriching for the child. We curated the kits with the infants in mind. The materials needed to be very safe, and they have to offer infinite possibilities for shared literacy routines. Relationships also took center stage in our program. Families discovered that more can be done during lockdowns to support their infants' development from birth. Our youngest student then was 3 months old. Gender stereotypes were broken as both fathers and mothers became invested in the care of infants during the lockdown. We witnessed fathers being very hands-on for care and development teams. When the quarantines eased, even the grandparents, cousins, uncles, and aunties joined in our online workshops. The isolation from the extended quarantine took a toll on our family. Finding their village through our program was key to sustaining their participation. We changed the format of the workshop from being sharing activity implementations to co-creating with other families. This was much preferred by our parents. More resources were sent to the family. These portfolios served as additional keepsakes, and although they found it enjoying having these keepsakes with them or their family, they were still more invested in our weekly meetings to do literacy routines with their newfound community. Therefore, community building became possible even while we were all isolated by the prolonged quarantines. Although our budget was limited, we opted to invest in high quality materials so that they can last throughout the preschool years, maybe even beyond. We wanted the kids to grow with the children while we explored more ways to improve the sustainability and appropriateness of the materials. The publication of this chapter revitalized us to return to the drawing board and to extend the possibilities of our kits. Future directions of this project include using local resources to create novel and indigenous open-ended materials in partnership with master craftsmen. Thank you, and we welcome collaboration with all.
Thank you. Many thanks.
Thank you also.
Okay, so we'll move directly on to our next presentation, and our next contributor is Charles Mifsud, Professor of Language and Literacy Education and Director of the Centre for Literacy at the University of Malta. And I think Charles's chapter focuses on the impact of family literacy in Malta as an example of a small island state. I'll give the floor to you, Professor Mifsud.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can you see my presentation okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so from a very big land of the Philippines with over 7,000 islands, bring you to a very small country, Malta, in the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, my chapter is called Small is Beautiful or Not, the impact of family literacy programs in a multilingual small island state. Of course, small is not always beautiful. There is the beautiful, the bad, and the ugly. But more about that as we go along. Okay, I'm trying to move this. Okay, so we're talking about Malta, which is a multilingual island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, where we have two official languages, Maltese and English, where these two languages coexist with many other languages of migrants and refugees who have made Malta their home. Malta is a member of the European Union and also forms part of the Commonwealth of Nations. In recent years, we have experienced considerable societal change. The population has increased by 20% with a huge influx of workers from all over the world. And we would like to continue building on the positive experiences we've had with family literacy and other success stories. And because of the multilingual nature of our situation, our educational context, we are increasingly using techniques like translanguaging and language mediation, where one language is used to support the acquisition and understanding of other languages. So just to put things in perspective, this is the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea has often been called the cradle of civilization. That's why it's Mediterranean, because it's in the middle of the land, the world as it was known in the beginning of civilization. And yes, Malta is somewhere there in the very center within the larger Mediterranean Sea, as you can see, at the crossroads of many other civilizations and countries. Okay, my chapter presented 4 studies on the impact of family literacy programs on children and parents in Malta. Through our first study, we showed the effectiveness of literacy programs as they support parental education, especially when it's demonstrated to parents how they can share work with their children. The second study, we showed how the program was successful most of the time, sometimes not, in eliciting children's individual responses to stories and books, and promoted their connectedness to the stories being presented. We worked with low socioeconomic status families, and also we investigated the role of e-books, digital books, in engaging bilingual families and multilingual families in shared reading, especially at home. We worked with 5 literacy programs. This is to give you a taste of Maltese. Aqramiyaj, the Read With Me program for 0 to 3 children. Seher Listeyer, the Magic of Stories for children 4 to 7. Gostil Ari, the Pleasure of Reading for 8 to 11-year-olds and their parents. Then we had the one which is called the Club Nahla, the B Club, for after-school intervention in a non-formal setting for 6 to 7-year-old students experiencing literary difficulties together with their parents. And the last program we looked at was the one called the Noir Blossoms, which is an after-school program for 8 to 11-year-olds experiencing literacy difficulties and their parents. Okay, so many findings, which you will find in the actual book, but what we wanted to look at, I wanted to just present a bit, was the actual children's responses to the stories during the group reading sessions, as you can see demonstrated here. The findings show that the child participants offered personal responses throughout the session and further explored the story that was read to them as they narrated their own life experiences. So the stories actually gave them the opportunity to narrate their own life experiences with such diversity and much cultural setting. It allowed the children who had been in that group for some time or newly joined the group to share their own life experiences. Storybook reading techniques used by the session animators, such as questioning and using actions, sounds, singing, different tones of voice, help the children to feel included and to engage with and respond to the stories. And the activities which were served as a preparation for the storybook reading excuse me, that increased the children's responses to the stories. This allowed a big interplay of the contributions from all the participants in the storytelling session with such a diversity of nationalities and cultures, including the children and the parents and the animator of the session. And the stimuli generated by the story augmented the children's responses during the group reading sessions. One thing we looked at closely was the value of digital books. And in view of the increasing pervasiveness of digital technologies in households, in Maltese households, we wanted to ensure that they were used effectively on our literacy programs. So we documented the unique value of e-books in engaging bilingual and multilingual families in shared reading at home through participant videos, questionnaires, and structured interview data. We discovered positive engagement by the participating family, substantiated with 3 main themes from the participants' interview reports. And these were that the families were keen on having a balanced use of e-books and print books, the importance of nurturing the child's independence with the e-book, to actually allow the child to use the e-book, the digital book, independently. And we looked at the unique value of e-books for the child's learning, especially in terms of repetition in this case. So we arrived at a number of conclusions. but that can be seen in the chapter, but I will focus on the multilingual perspective. Multilingual approaches are required to promote active and inclusive learning in multilingual settings. Having staff, excuse me, I've been sick lately, so I'm recovering. Having staff from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds who adopt a multilingual approach may render the program more attractive to families who speak other languages than the local ones. Bilingual and multilingual reading strategies have proven effective in this regard. And it was an opportunity to enable children to interact using all their linguistic resources, including their home languages. This gave them the opportunity to enhance their oral skills and their engagement in learning activities. For example, interactive storybook reading based on culturally relevant story told in both the home language and the second language supported vocabulary development across languages. And of course, to conclude, we recognize that further research is needed on multilingualism in family literacy programs in Malta and beyond, especially within different contexts, both small and large. We need to investigate to what extent educators are supporting translanguaging and language mediation and the effectiveness of these strategies. We need to encourage multilingualism and diversity in the face of linguistic imperialism and powerful globalization forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting again to hear the importance of multilingualism, which is one of the big themes across the publication, and also to hear again how technology, which is often considered to be a barrier to dialogue between the generations, can actually promote and facilitate it. So we'll go on to our next and our final speaker today, Zoya Kincaid-Clark, who is Senior Lecturer at the Early Childhood Education School of Education at the University of the West Indies. And I'll give the floor to you, Dr. Kincaid-Clark. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
thank you.
Thanks. I was saying good morning, everyone. Special thanks and congratulations to the other chapter contributors. So my chapter, co-authored by myself and Charlotte Hardiker, is entitled Creating a Space for Understanding Caribbean Family Literacy Practices. And so here is Charlotte and I. Charlotte is now at the University of Manchester Metropolitan University. So for persons who don't know, so the research context for this chapter is the Caribbean, or more specifically, what we classify as the Anglophone Caribbean, which many of the islands predominantly come together to form the Caribbean community. And this is a composite and very cosmopolitan region that has predominantly been formed by migration or through migration, emigration, and immigration. So in our chapter, we talk a lot about Caribbean family practices, and we speak to the fact that a lot of it is not clearly understood in the global space. And so though there have been frequent attempts, we say, to understand Caribbean practices, this has often been done through a Eurocentric lens. And this has created a narrative that's not very Caribbean-centric. So we talk a lot about literacy in the Caribbean as a center, just as the majority of Caribbean peoples, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, the majority of Caribbean peoples are of African descent. And so this plays a huge role in how literacy is practiced within the region. We're very exotic in that we have we have a rich music history, rich storytelling history, and what we call dancing or carnival in Trinidad and Tobago. So this is the primary means through which literacy is practiced within the region. And this is actually some of the first instances or experiences that children will have with literacy. And so this is the predominant way that literacy is practiced within families. And so storytelling is a big thing, where in small and large ways, persons will gather and they will share stories. And this is from the youngest of children to the oldest of persons. Dancing and dance halls, as we have in Jamaica, is a huge thing where we highlight how music is the primary means through which we are able to transmit a lot of lessons and life lessons. And so many persons would have, perhaps would know Bob Marley, he sharing his stories through music, but it still remains that music is a very important tool for the transmission and the teaching of literacy. But there are misunderstandings of what literacy is. And so because of that, there is an exclusion of understanding Caribbean literacy practices and family literacy practices in the region. And this is primarily because of colonization. So we have what we understand in Jamaica is that there is a hierarchical approach to knowledge, which is framed through epistemologies of ignorance and epistemological exclusion and what we call epistemic injustice. And so we don't give a space to understanding the dance hall, understanding storytelling, understanding music and dance, and how that transmits literacy in the region. And so one of this is that one of the factors that we've noted in literacy and what we classify as epistemic injustice is the so-called evidence-based approaches, where a lot of what we know about literacy is framed within an understanding of numbers. So we highlight that the numbers game is what percentage of the Jamaican population or what percentage of the Caribbean population is literate, without understanding that there is all Caribbean nationals are literate, but the literate that is being measured is what we call school-based literacy or Eurocentric approaches to literacy. And so there is no one who is measuring the school child who is able to learn his lessons through music, or who is able to partake of what his knowledge is through music. There is no one who is measuring young boys or Rastafarians sitting in a group and reasoning. Nobody's measuring that literacy, where we're passing down information through a communal style, a circle style approach, where we're passing on information and sharing knowledge. No one is measuring literacy based on a child in Trinidad and Tobago who is able to, through art, he or she is able to document and create wonderful pieces that relate and refer to Trinidadian culture. So we know this. But when we talk about entrenching literacy, from the get-go, we've had a wonderful opportunity to do that. Jamaica was made independent or gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1962. In 1966, one of our soon-to-be, we hope, national heroes, a stalwart in Jamaican culture, Louise Bennett, she started a program on television called Ring Ding. Now, Ring Ding is actually lasted for several decades, and it actually began before the more famous or popularly known Sesame Street. And what Louise Bennett was able to do is she was able to show many Jamaican children and families that their voice was important. She was able to swing her voice between standard British English, what we then knew and now we now know as standard Jamaican English, and she swung it towards what we now know as patois, or speaking the Jamaican vernacular. So coming out of Louise Bennett's Ring Ding program on national television, we also had in 1974 the largest family literacy program across the region, across the Caribbean region, and this was known as the Jamal movement, or the Jamaica movement for the advancement of literacy. In the 1970s, in 1970, our national census in Jamaica indicated that less than 70% of the Jamaican population was able to use conventional forms of literacy. And while the Jamal program was touted to be a huge success in terms of the numbers game, which is contributing and increasing the percentage of the Jamaican population who was literate, In my chapter, we also highlight the other benefits to families from participating in this. As I shared at the start of my presentation, Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean is a population or region that is heavily migratory, migrants coming in and migrants going out. And following the movement of Jamaicans and other Caribbean nationals to the UK, what it resulted in is that many times families would receive letters, but parents were unable to read those letters. And so we highlight the power of literacy and family literacy as being able to keep in touch with each other across borders and across rivers and across oceans. Likewise, we also highlight the other benefits of the Jamal program, which is parents who are unable to read would carry their youngest children with them. And so parents and children would sit together and they would practice reading. And in the 1970s, before we had a mass rural electrification program, you would have parents sitting at kerosene lamps with their children practicing reading and practicing other forms of literacy. And so this proved to be a tremendous and a phenomenal approach to family literacy that we have not accounted for and is dare not accounted for in traditional understandings of literacy that we see that was shared earlier today. And so in our book, or in the chapter, we also highlight understandings of literacy in Jamaica, and we highlight impediments and the drivers. And we end our chapter by making recommendations for more egalitarian approaches to family literacy. And we position this or ground this in an understanding that taking practices which take into account unique approaches to family literacy in the Caribbean takes into account the richness and values of other experience other than that is promoted in Euro-American centric literacy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that it will, what you say about the evidence-based approach to policy and the inherent biases and injustices in that will really resonate with a lot of people. It certainly resonates with me from my experience in education advocacy in the past. But thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. I think that was really insightful and fascinating. And even though I don't think we have any direct questions from the audience, I can see that there's a lot of appreciation of the presentations there. I mean, I have one question that I'd like to put to the editors, which is how you build on the work that you've done in this book and how you move from where we are in terms of the research that you've collected together, the evidence that you've collected together, to influencing policy, to changing the minds of policymakers. Because one thing that I encountered in the past is how difficult it is, even when you try to monetize the evidence that you have to make a difference in this area and convince policymakers that family learning is important.
Maybe Esther, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you so much for this question, Paul, and then I will respond.
Nice way to hand off the question to me. That's a really tough question. I think it really depends on the specific political, social context, where in some places that's going to be a lot more difficult than others. I'll maybe just by way of example, bring up a project that my colleagues at the Goodling Institute and I have been working on since 2018. We received funding from a private foundation, the William Penn Foundation, to evaluate 5 family literacy programs in Philadelphia. And this funder really did not give any parameters for what the outcome measures should be. So we were able to essentially have a blank slate. And so we, with our pre-post survey and other measures, really tried to think of literacy expansively. So it wasn't just, do you read, storybooks to your child? It was, do you sing? Do you, play music or make music? Do you do arts and crafts? Do you talk about, science or numbers as you're going about your day. So I think one answer to the question is at the level of the funders, because I think the funders, which aren't always the government, often set the parameters for what counts as literacy and what counts as learning. And so if we can have funders take a more expansive view of what meaningful outcomes are, then I think that gives educators on the ground just a lot more flexibility to measure what families are really learning and to measure the things that matter to them. Because I know that's a common complaint in the United States, at least, that the government prescribed measures don't really do justice to the myriad things that families and children are learning.
Thank you, Esther. Building on what Esther highlighted, I think it's also at the level of UNESCO, for example, as an institute ourselves. Such resource enriches the content and the knowledge of our programs as well, and help us advocate for examining definitions of literacy from different perspectives. And as some of the authors here highlighted, that looking at the diversity epistemologically, but also practically, of literacy practices, and then build on them rather than looking at the literacy from a deficit perspective. And I think one of the important thing I would like to highlight is that I wanted to say these things at the end in the concluding remarks, that by publishing this book as an open access, not behind the paywall, I think Esther and myself and all the authors, we have really contributed to the vision of democratization of the knowledge and the openness and freely sharing such knowledge across the globe. The purpose of this book was not just for the global south, but actually the book it needs to help all of us across different countries, including particularly in the global north, looking at the practices, diverse practices, but also epistemologies, cultures, and communities and intergenerational traditions, learning traditions from around the world. And I want to highlight that these practices are not only characteristic of the communities which are marginalized, but they are here right next to us. But we need to learn how to acknowledge and recognize these practices as well. And I also think that we brought together the chapter authors from around the world, from different disciplines as well, hoping that someday the authors as well as researchers who are reading this book will be developing cross-border, cross-language research partnerships. And I'm not saying that this is the end of the project of such resource, but it's actually the beginning for enriching our knowledge and understanding of these practices of family and intergenerational literacy and learning. And I truly believe what Professor Kincaid Clark highlighted is really the goal should be about epistemic diversity. And I think I want to stop here before I go and say all the words from my concluding remarks.
Thanks so much. You've answered the question really fully. I think the open access point is worth repeating as well, because that was a very definite decision that we made early on, that we wanted as many people as possible to have access to this. We wanted something that was truly going to be influential and that was going to be widely read. So we're out of time. Let me thank again all of the panelists and the editors for the insightful contributions, and for the audience for your thoughtful attention. I'll hand back now to Rakhat for your concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Esther. Thanks to all the authors who presented their work, their chapters today. However, I want to highlight and acknowledge the authors of other 15 chapters, which you didn't unfortunately hear today during the webinar. But I would like to invite you all to please download the free book, share it freely among your colleagues, networks, as well as family members to learn more about the approach which we are talking about in the book and unpacking the notion, practice, and as well as understanding of family and intergenerational literacy and learning. I want to highlight that as many of the authors of the book, including Esther myself, we really tried to bring the rich practices and perspectives. However, I want to also acknowledge that we didn't do a very expansive understanding as well, because we still have a lot to unpack. And I think the book itself gives a motivation for some of you here, whether you're a participant or contributing author, to take this project and move to the next level, which is actually further building knowledge based on family learning and intergenerational learning as well. I also want to highlight that the book is hopefully you will be using the book and the book chapters in your undergraduate graduate programs as an approach to really develop next generation of educators, trainers, policymakers, and researchers as well. And we really want to see diversity of such programs across the world and in different communities too. Lastly, I really hope that the book itself will help us to not just bring together different perspectives, but recognize, also celebrate diversity of our humanity. And I think, and cultures. With this, I would really encourage you, please download, share. You can also organize different kind of launch events if you would like to do so, and we'll be happy to support you as much as we can. But please do also get in touch with us, with the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, to, or if you are interested for further partnerships as well. We'll be happy to share the knowledge and resources and the trainings that we have at the Institute. I'm sure the Esther and the Goodling Institute will be there as well. And our authors are the rich resource that we have developed through this book project. And thank you so much for all of you for participating and for contributing to this wonderful webinar to celebrate a nice project such as this book.